something about graveyards at night. Maybe it's the way the air feels colder there, or how every sound, no matter how small, carries like a scream. Whatever it is, it makes people avoid them when the sun goes down. Except for Jamie and Chris. Jamie was a skeptic, the type of guy who thought ghosts were just fairy tales for adults. Chris, on the other hand, was a thrill-seeker. He'd been to abandoned hospitals, haunted hotels, and once even spent a night in the woods where a kid had gone missing years ago. So, when Chris suggested they break into Green Hollow Cemetery for a little midnight exploration, Jamie reluctantly agreed. It was late October, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the cracked headstones. Green Hollow had been closed for decades. There were rumors of grave robbers, satanic rituals, even whispers about how some of the bodies buried there had been found outside their coffins, half decayed and clawing at the earth. But those were just stories, right? The gate was easy to slip through, rusted and bent in places. Inside, the graveyard stretched endlessly, a maze of tombstones and overgrown grass. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic. "You scared yet?" Chris asked, flashing his phone's flashlight at Jamie's face. "Of this?" Jamie scoffed. "Nah, looks like every other graveyard I've ever seen." Chris grinned. "Good. Let's check out the mausoleum." The mausoleum was an imposing structure near the center of the cemetery. Its stone walls were streaked with moss, and the iron door looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Chris pushed it, and to Jamie's surprise, it creaked open without much effort. Inside, the smell hit them first, thick and sour like rotten meat. Chris gagged but stepped in anyway, his phone's light bouncing off dusty stone walls and empty niches where caskets had once been. "See?" Jamie said, his voice echoing. "Nothing here, but..." A loud thud cut him off. "What the hell was that?" Chris whispered, his flashlight swinging wildly. Jamie's chest tightened. "Probably just an animal, or the wind." "Wind doesn't make a sound like that," Chris said. They both stood frozen, listening. For a moment there was nothing but their breathing. Then it came again, a soft shuffling like something being dragged across the floor. Chris pointed his flashlight toward the back of the mausoleum. "Stay here," he said, but Jamie grabbed his arm. "Are you nuts? Don't..." Too late. Chris was already moving, his light cutting through the darkness. Jamie stayed by the door, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "Chris!" he called after a moment. No answer. "Chris!" Still nothing. Jamie hesitated, then cursed under his breath and followed. The mausoleum was bigger than it looked from the outside, with narrow hallways branching off in every direction. Jamie took a left, then a right, trying to follow the faint glow of Chris's flashlight. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the metallic smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. "Chris, this isn't funny," he shouted. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. At first, Jamie thought it was Chris, but as he stepped closer, he realized the figure was too tall, too thin. Its face was pale and blank, like it had been carved out of wax. Jamie froze. The figure didn't move, then it twitched. Jamie stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. In the dim light, he saw the figure start to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate, its head tilting as if it were studying him. He turned and ran, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't stop until he was back at the entrance, but Chris wasn't there. "Chris!" he shouted, his voice cracking. No response. Behind him, the shuffling sound grew louder. Jamie bolted out of the mausoleum, not daring to look back. He ran through the cemetery, past rows of silent headstones, until he reached the gate. He didn't stop until he was in his car, slamming the door and locking it. The next morning, Jamie went back with the police. They searched the mausoleum and the entire cemetery, but there was no sign of Chris. The only thing they found was Chris's phone lying on the floor at the back of the mausoleum. The last video on it was just static, but if you listened closely, you could hear something underneath it. A faint whisper, repeating the same word over and over. "Stay." Everyone in Coldwater knew about the Hollow Man. It's the kind of story kids whisper at sleepovers, the kind that gets passed down and warped over the years. The details change, but the gist stays the same. If you're alone in Westfield Cemetery after midnight, and you hear someone call your name, don't turn around. If you do, he'll take something from you. Some say it's your soul, others your face. No one agrees on what exactly happens, just that you'll be gone. I never believed it. Not until last year. It was October, one of those nights where the air's so cold it feels like it bites. I was working late at the hardware store, and my buddy Mark dared me to walk through the cemetery on my way home. It's the shortest route, but no one uses it after dark. Not because of the Hollow Man, of course. Most people just say it's creepy. Mark thought it was hilarious. He even handed me his old flashlight and said, "If you see him, tell him I said hi." I shrugged it off and went. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive. The wind made the trees creak, and every so often I'd hear a rustle in the bushes. Probably a raccoon, I told myself. Still, I kept the flashlight beam low, just enough to see the cracked pathway in front of me. About halfway through, I started feeling watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, like someone's standing just behind you? I stopped and looked around. Nothing. "Get a grip," I muttered, but my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. I kept walking, faster now. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and low, coming from somewhere behind me. "Daniel." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just that the voice said my name, it was the way it said it, like it was right there, just over my shoulder. I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to look. But I remembered the stories. "Don't turn around." The voice came again, closer this time. "Daniel?" It sounded wrong, like someone trying to speak with a mouthful of dirt. I started walking faster, my legs stiff and clumsy. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move in the beam. "Daniel!" the voice rasped. I broke into a run. The flashlight bounced in my hand, and the path blurred beneath my feet. The gate wasn't far. I could see the iron bars gleaming in the moonlight. That's when I felt it. Something brushed against my shoulder, cold and dry, like brittle leaves. "Daniel," it whispered right in my ear. I screamed and bolted for the gate, not caring if I tripped or dropped the flashlight. I didn't stop running until I was out of the cemetery, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I got home, I locked every door and window and didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, Mark called. "Man, you look like hell," he said when I showed up to work. "Didn't sleep?" I told him about the voice, about how it said my name. He laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on," he said. "You're telling me you heard the Hollow Man? That's just a dumb story." But there was something in his eyes, something that said he wasn't so sure. That night, Mark didn't go home. He'd stayed late to lock up the store, and when I came in the next morning, the cops were there. They said he was found in Westfield Cemetery, sitting against a headstone. His face was gone. I don't mean injured or cut. I mean gone, like someone had erased it with a giant eraser. They ruled it a freak accident, something about a wild animal. But I know the truth. Now, every time I walk past the cemetery, I hear it again, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Daniel. It started with a dare, doesn't it always? Tommy, Lisa, and I had spent all summer trying to outdo each other. Stupid stuff, like climbing the tallest tree in the park or sneaking into Old Man Henderson's barn. But that night, sitting around the fire in Tommy's backyard, Lisa grinned and said, "Let's go to Ravenswood." Ravenswood Cemetery, the oldest one in town. Half the graves there don't even have names, just dates carved into crumbling stone. People say it's haunted because of course they do. Every town has a place like that. "No way," Tommy said, tossing a marshmallow into his mouth. "They lock it up at night," Lisa smirked. "I know a way in." That's how we ended up standing outside the iron gates at midnight, shivering in the October chill. Lisa wasn't kidding about knowing a way in. She led us to a hole in the fence, just big enough to squeeze through. "Don't chicken out," she whispered as we crawled through. The cemetery was darker than I expected. The trees blocked out most of the moonlight, and our flashlights cast jittery beams on the overgrown grass and leaning headstones. It was dead quiet, pun not intended. Lisa was the first to speak. "Let's find the angel statue." She was talking about this old monument in the middle of the cemetery. It's famous around here, mostly because of the story. The Angel of Ravenswood, they call it. A life-sized statue, carved from marble, of an angel holding a sword. The legend goes that if you stand in front of it at midnight and say, "I'm not afraid of you," the angel moves. Just a dumb story, Tommy muttered, but his voice was tight. We found the statue near the center of the graveyard, just like Lisa said. It was huge, probably 10 feet tall, and its eyes seemed to follow us as we approached. "Creepy," I said, trying to laugh it off. Lisa turned to us, her flashlight under her chin. "Who's going first?" Tommy shook his head. "This was your idea, Lisa. You do it." She shrugged, stepped up to the statue, and cleared her throat. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. Nothing happened. "See?" she said, spinning around. "Just a stupid—" Behind her, the statue's head moved. At first, I thought I imagined it, the way the shadows played tricks on you in the dark. But then Tommy grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "Did you see that?" he hissed. The statue was looking at Lisa now. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were curious. Lisa froze. "Very funny, guys," she said, her voice shaking. "We didn't do anything," Tommy whispered. Then the angel stepped down. I swear to God it moved like it was alive. its marble feet crunching the gravel path. Lisa screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a headstone. "Run!" Tommy yelled, but I couldn't move. I was too busy staring at the angel. Its face wasn't carved marble anymore. It was flesh, pale and cold, with empty black eyes that seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth twisted into a smile, showing rows of jagged teeth. It turned to me. That's when I ran. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. Branches slapping my face, the sound of footsteps behind me, and Tommy screaming my name. We made it out somehow. When we got back to Tommy's house, Lisa wasn't with us. We told his parents, then the cops. They searched the cemetery for hours, but they never found her. The statue, though? The Angel of Ravenswood? It was back on its pedestal, its head turned slightly to the side, like it was watching us leave. Let me tell you about what happened to me last year. It's the kind of thing I'd laugh off if someone else told me, but I lived it, and it's burned into my brain like a bad dream that doesn't end. It started with a job. Nothing fancy, just something to pay the bills while I figured out my next move. The ad said, groundskeeper needed, and it was for Black Hollow Cemetery. I'd driven past the place 100 times. It's tucked away at the edge of town, where the woods get thick and the streetlights are just a memory. When I met old Pete, the guy who'd worked there for decades, he looked like he'd been carved out of driftwood, gnarled, wiry, and tired. He handed me a ring of keys and said, "It's easy work. Mow the grass, pick up the trash, lock the gates at sunset, and for the love of God, don't stay after dark." I thought he was just being dramatic. Everyone's got their little superstitions, right? But there was something in the way he said it, like he really meant it. The first few weeks were uneventful, peaceful even. I liked the quiet. There was something calming about working among the headstones, with the wind in the trees and the distant hum of the highway. But then I noticed something strange. It started small. Tools I left in the shed would be moved the next morning, or a section of grass I hadn't touched would already be mowed. I figured Pete was coming back to check up on me, even though he swore he was retired. One evening, as I was locking the gates, I saw a man standing near the oldest part of the cemetery. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that looked like it belonged in the 19th century. "Hey!" I called. "We're closed!" He didn't move. I sighed and started walking toward him, but when I looked up again, he was gone. Just gone. The next morning I found fresh dirt in front of one of the older graves. Not like someone had dug it up, but like it had been disturbed. I checked the records, and the grave belonged to a man named Elias Crowther, buried in 1889. I asked Pete about it when I ran into him at the diner later that week. He went pale. "You saw him, didn't you? The man in the suit." I nodded, and Pete leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to quit that job, son. Get out while you still can." I laughed, but it came out shaky. "Why? What's the big deal?" Pete's hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. "There's something wrong with that place. Always has been. They say Crowther was a grave robber back in the day. Stole from the dead. When the townsfolk caught him, they buried him alive in that cemetery as punishment. He cursed the place with his dying breath. And now, anyone who lingers too long..." He trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. That night, I stayed late. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove Pete wrong. Maybe I just didn't believe in curses. It was quiet at first, just the usual sounds. Wind in the trees, crickets chirping. But then I heard it, a faint scratching, like nails on wood. I followed the sound to Crowther's grave. The dirt was moving, shifting like something was underneath. My breath caught in my throat. "This isn't real," I whispered. But it was. The ground cracked open, and a hand shot out. Thin, gray, and withered, but unmistakably alive. I ran. God help me, I ran like my life depended on it. Because it did. As I reached the gate, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't look back. Pete's warning echoed in my mind. Don't stay after dark. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The next morning, I went back to the cemetery, expecting to find the place in shambles, but everything was normal. No disturbed graves, no scratches on the gate, just the quiet, empty cemetery. I quit that day. Pete didn't say, "I told you so," when I ran into him again. He just nodded and said, "Smart move." But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps. And I'll never go near Black Hollow Cemetery again. There's something about cemeteries at night that doesn't sit right. The air feels thicker, the quiet deeper. It's like the place knows you don't belong. I learned that the hard way 2 years ago, on a night I wish I could forget. My cousin Jake was always the wild one. He had this way of daring you into things, making you feel like a coward if you said no. That's how I ended up in Black Willow Cemetery at midnight with a bottle of cheap whiskey and a flashlight that barely worked. The idea was simple, or so Jake said. We'd spend an hour there, just hanging out, maybe telling some ghost stories, and then leave. Easy. But Black Willow wasn't just any cemetery. It had a reputation. The older folks in town told stories about people who'd gone missing there. The fog gets you, they'd say. I never believed it. Fog's just fog, right? That night, it rolled in thick as soup. We hadn't been there 5 minutes before the air turned damp and cold. The kind of cold that settles in your bones. Jake laughed and took a swig from the bottle. "This is nothing," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "People just like to scare themselves. There's nothing out here but old stones and dead folks." I wanted to believe him, but something felt off. The fog wasn't normal. It didn't move right. Instead of drifting, it seemed alive, swirling around the headstones like it had a purpose. "Let's walk around," Jake said, already stomping off into the mist. "Jake, come on," I called after him. But he was gone, swallowed up by the fog. I followed, the flashlight beam cutting through the haze. The headstones loomed like broken teeth, and I swear I could hear whispers. Too soft to make out, but they were there. "Jake!" I shouted. My voice sounded small, like the fog was swallowing it too. Then I saw him, standing in front of an old mausoleum. It was one of those ancient ones with moss-covered stone and an iron gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. "What are you doing?" I asked, jogging up to him. Jake didn't answer. He just stood there staring at the gate. "Jake?" I touched his shoulder, and he jerked like I'd shocked him. "What?" he snapped, his voice shaky. "What's wrong with you?" He looked at me, his face pale. "I thought I saw someone go in there." I frowned. "The gate's locked. No one's in there." Jake shook his head. "I'm telling you, I saw it. A man. He walked right through the gate." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "You've had too much whiskey." But then I heard it, a soft creak, like hinges moving. The gate. It swung open slowly, the iron scraping against stone. Jake and I froze, staring as the dark entrance to the mausoleum yawned open. "Hell no," I muttered, stepping back. Jake, being Jake, moved closer. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. Something moved inside. At first I thought it was just the fog, but then I saw it. Figure, tall and thin, standing in the shadows. "Who's there?" Jake demanded. The figure stepped forward, and my blood turned to ice. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but his eyes, they were wrong. Empty, black, like staring into a void. Jake stumbled back, his bravado gone. "We should go," he whispered. But the man, or whatever it was, moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. "Run," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. We bolted, the fog closing in around us. I couldn't tell which way we were going. Every direction looked the same. The whispers grew louder, swirling in my ears, words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my gut. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, slow, heavy, unhurried. "Keep going," I shouted, dragging Jake along. Then Jake screamed. I turned, and he was gone. Gone. 1 second he was there, and the next, the fog swallowed him whole. "Jake!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, low and raspy, echoed through the fog. "Leave!" I didn't need to be told twice. I ran until I found the fence, climbed over it, and didn't stop running until I was back home. The cops searched the cemetery the next day, but found nothing. No sign of Jake, no open mausoleum, no man with black eyes. They said he probably ran off, got lost in the woods. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about that fog. And when I wake up, I swear I can still hear those whispers. There's a story that every small town has, one that no one ever writes down, but everyone knows. Ours was about old Harris, the gravedigger. Harris had worked at Greenwood Cemetery since before I was born. People said he came with the place, like he just stepped out of the shadows one day and never left. He was a quiet, wiry old man, with hands like twisted roots and a face that looked like it had seen too much. I only met him once, back when I was 16. My buddies and I were sneaking around the cemetery one October night, looking for a place to drink the beer Kyle had stolen from his dad. We found ourselves by the caretaker's shed, a rickety old thing leaning against the hill. That's when Harris appeared. He wasn't loud or anything. He just stepped out of the dark like he'd always been there, holding that rusty lantern of his. "You boys shouldn't be here," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. We froze, beer cans in hand. "What's the big deal?" Kyle asked, trying to sound tough. "It's just a bunch of dead people." Harris stared at him for a long moment, the lantern casting strange shadows on his face. "You think the dead like being disturbed?" Kyle laughed, but it sounded nervous. They're dead. They don't care. Harris didn't smile. He just tilted his head toward the gravestones behind him. Some of them don't stay that way. That shut Kyle up. Go on home, Harris said, before you find out the hard way. We didn't need to be told twice, but that wasn't the last time I saw Harris. 2 weeks later, on Halloween night, I was walking home from a party. The road cut past Greenwood Cemetery, and even though I'd promised myself I'd never go near it after dark, I didn't have much choice. The fog was thick that night, rolling over the headstones like a ghostly tide. The only sound was the crunch of my sneakers on the gravel path. Then I saw it, the light from Harris's lantern bobbing in the distance. I didn't want to stop, but something about that light drew me in. Maybe it was the way it moved, like it was calling me. Or maybe it was the faint sound I thought I heard, something like a low, mournful hum. Before I knew it, I was standing at the gate, staring into the mist. Harris? I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. The light flickered, then moved deeper into the cemetery. Against my better judgment, I followed. The air grew colder with every step, the fog so thick I could barely see. The lantern was my only guide, its warm glow the only thing keeping the dark at bay. Harris! I called again. The light stopped. When I reached it, Harris was standing by an open grave, his lantern swinging gently at his side. Why'd you follow me? He asked without looking up. I don't know, I stammered. What are you doing out here? Same thing I always do, he said. Digging graves? He gestured to the hole at his feet. It was deep and dark, the kind of hole that felt like it went down forever. This one's fresh, he said, but it ain't for the living. I shivered, my breath fogging the air. What do you mean? Harris looked at me then, his eyes catching the light of the lantern. Sometimes the dead don't stay where they're put. Sometimes they need a little help finding their way back. A sound came from the darkness, a faint rustling like leaves on a cold wind. What was that? I whispered. Harris raised a finger to his lips. Don't move. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then I saw it, something moving through the fog, pale and twisted, its limbs jerking like a broken puppet. My legs felt like lead. I wanted to run, but Harris grabbed my arm. Hold still, he hissed. The thing emerged from the mist, dragging itself toward us. Its face was wrong, sunken eyes, skin pulled tight over jagged bone. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a gaping, black void. Don't look at it, Harris said, his voice low and urgent. Keep your eyes on the ground. I did as he said, staring at the dirt as the thing shambled closer. Harris lifted the lantern high, the light flaring brighter than it should have. The creature hissed, retreating into the shadows. When it was gone, Harris let out a long breath. What the hell was that? I asked, my voice shaking. One of the restless, he said. They come out on nights like this when the veil's thin. Most folks never see them. Why not? Because they don't come back to tell about it. Harris looked at me, his expression grave. Go home, kid, and don't come back here at night, ever. I didn't need to be told twice. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened. She gave me a strange look and said, Harris, he died 5 years ago, had a heart attack in the caretaker's shed. Oh, I didn't believe her until I saw the obituary she kept in an old scrapbook. I haven't been back to Greenwood Cemetery since, but every Halloween, I leave a lantern on my porch, just in case. There's something about cemeteries at night that just feels wrong. Not scary, necessarily. Wrong. Like you're walking in a place you shouldn't be, where the air is heavier, where the shadows are just a little darker than they should be. I learned that the hard way when I took the graveyard shift at Maplewood Cemetery. It wasn't a glamorous job, mowing grass, fixing broken headstones, making sure no kids were sneaking into smoke pot or scare each other to death. But it paid decent, and for a guy like me, with no real prospects and bills piling up, that was good enough. The place itself wasn't creepy during the day. Maplewood was old, sure, lots of cracked marble and angel statues with missing wings, but it was peaceful, quiet. The night shift, though, was a different story. It started on a Wednesday. My boss, Mr. Gibbons, handed me a flashlight and a set of keys before he left. Keep an eye out, he said. Had some reports of kids messing around back by the east lot. Got it, I said, trying not to let on how nervous I was. The east lot was the oldest part of the cemetery, the kind of place where the headstones were so worn you couldn't read the names anymore. It was also where the locals said the weird stuff happened. Voices in the wind, shadows that didn't match up with anything, that kind of thing. I didn't believe in ghosts, but walking through that part of the cemetery alone, yeah, it made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, metallic sound, like a shovel scraping against stone. I froze. The cemetery was supposed to be empty, and I hadn't seen any cars pull in. Hello? I called out, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Just rows of headstones and the twisted branches of old oak trees. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. Closer this time. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I followed the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to a fresh grave, the dirt still soft and loose. The shovel was there, stuck in the ground. But there was no one around. I looked at the grave marker. It was blank. That's when I noticed the dirt. It wasn't just soft. It was moving, shifting like something was trying to crawl its way out. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Before I could run, I heard a low, guttural moan, and then a hand broke through the dirt. I wish I could say I screamed or ran or did something sensible, but I just stood there, frozen, as more of it emerged, a pale, skeletal figure, its hollow eyes locked on me. "Help me," it croaked, its voice dry and cracked like dead leaves. My legs finally started working, and I backed away, nearly tripping over a headstone. "Stay back," I shouted, holding up the flashlight like it was going to do something. The thing dragged itself out of the grave, its movements slow and jerky. It was wearing a tattered suit, the kind people used to bury their dead in 100 years ago. "I need help," it said again, reaching for me with fingers like brittle twigs. I don't know what came over me, but I stopped. Something about its voice. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded sad, desperate. What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. The thing pointed to the headstone behind it. The name had been worn away by time, but I could make out the dates, 1847, 1875. "They forgot me," it said. "Left me here, alone." I didn't know what to say. How do you comfort something like that? But before I could think of an answer, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned, expecting to see Mr. Gibbons or maybe a cop. Instead, there were more of them. Dozens of figures, pale and broken, shambling toward us from the shadows. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes watching, their voices whispering, "Help us." Forgotten. Alone. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. Their cold hands pulling at me. The sound of dirt shifting. The smell of decay. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining and the cemetery looked normal again. Except for the grave. The one with the blank headstone. My boss found me sitting there, covered in dirt and shaking like a leaf. He asked me what happened, but I couldn't explain it. I quit that day. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them. Scraping, whispering, calling for someone to remember them, and every time, I wonder how long it'll be before they come for me again. Back when I was a kid, my grandpa used to tell me that cemeteries weren't scary. "They're the quietest places on earth," he'd say. "Ain't no trouble from the dead. It's the living you've got to watch out for." That was before I took the job at Black Hollow Cemetery. Before I learned the truth about what really happens when the sun sets and the gates close. It started with the ad in the paper. Gravedigger wanted. Night shift, no experience necessary. It wasn't my first choice, but work was work. Black Hollow was a small, out-of-the-way place, surrounded by miles of woods. The kind of cemetery no one really visited anymore. When I got there, the caretaker, Mr. Yates, was leaning against the gate, smoking a cigarette. He was an old guy, grizzled and wiry, with a face like crumpled leather. "You sure about this, kid?" he asked as he handed me a flashlight and a key ring. Why wouldn't I be? He just smirked like he knew something I didn't. "You'll see. Once nurse, my first few nights were uneventful. I'd patrol the grounds, check the gates, and make sure none of the local teens were sneaking in to drink or mess around. It was boring, honestly. Then, on the 5th night, I found the open grave. It was in the far corner of the cemetery, near the oldest section. The dirt was piled up neatly on the side, like someone had been digging. But there was no one around, and the grave didn't match any of the recent burials in the logbook. I figured it was a prank. Maybe some local kids trying to scare me off. So I filled it back in, packed the dirt down, and moved on. But the next night, it was open again. This time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Footprints. They were small, like a child's, and they led from the grave to the woods and back. My first thought was that it was some sick joke. But there was no way a kid was digging that fast. The grave was deep, too deep for a little kid to manage alone. I followed the footprints to the edge of the woods, but they disappeared into the trees. That night, I barely slept. The next time it happened, I decided to stay and watch. I sat in the caretaker's shed, flashlight in hand, and waited. Midnight came and went. Nothing. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing when I heard it. A faint, scraping sound. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the grave. The sound got louder as I got closer, like someone was dragging a shovel through the dirt. And when I reached the grave, I froze. There was a little girl standing in the hole. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Her dress was dirty and torn, and her hair hung in matted clumps around her face. She didn't look up. She just kept digging, her small hands clawing at the dirt like an animal. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. "What are you doing?" She stopped. Slowly she lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were empty, hollow. "Help me," she said, her voice soft and distant like it was coming from somewhere far away. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. What are you doing out here?" I stammered. "They put me here," she said, still staring at me. "But I'm not supposed to be here. I need to go home." I ran back to the shed and called the police. When they arrived, the girl was gone, but the grave was still there, open and empty. The cops didn't believe me, of course. They figured I was seeing things, maybe working too many late nights. But I knew what I saw, and it didn't stop. Every night, the grave would be open again. And every night, I'd see her. Sometimes she was digging, sometimes she was just standing there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. And sometimes she wasn't alone. One night I stayed in the shed, too scared to go out. Around 2 a.m., the door creaked open on its own. She was standing there, her dirty dress hanging limp, her empty eyes fixed on mine. "They won't let me leave," she said. "Who?" I whispered. She pointed behind her. I looked past her into the darkness and saw them, shadows moving between the headstones, dozens of them. They were coming closer, their shapes shifting and twisting in the moonlight. I slammed the door and locked it, but it didn't matter. The last thing I remember is their voices, whispering in unison. You can't bury the truth. When I woke up, it was morning. The shed was empty and the grave was filled in, the dirt packed down like it had never been touched. I quit that day. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see her, and I know deep down that she's not done with me yet. I remember the day I first walked into the cemetery like it was yesterday. It was a Sunday afternoon, just after the service at St. John's Church, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery behind it. It was a peaceful place, quiet, with trees that hung over the paths like old guardians. No one came here much anymore, not with the new cemetery on the edge of town, but this one had a kind of old-world charm to it, and I needed to clear my head. I didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary, but sometimes the dead don't stay dead. The first time I noticed it, I didn't think much of it. A single grave, marked by a small, unkempt stone off in the far corner of the cemetery. It was strange, though. There was no name, no dates, nothing. Just a single symbol. A strange, twisting vine that seemed to crawl around the stone like it was alive. I'd walked past it a few times, but something kept pulling me back to that grave. There was something about it, something that unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. The second time I came across the grave, I stopped. I don't know why. I couldn't take my eyes off the stone. I felt like it was calling to me, as if the earth beneath it was breathing. I knelt down, feeling a chill run up my spine. The air was heavier here, thick with the scent of earth and decay. I traced my finger over the symbol. A twisted vine. It looked like something out of a nightmare, something unnatural. I wiped the dirt away from the stone, thinking I could make out a name, but there was nothing, just the vine. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper almost too faint to hear. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just that whisper curling around me like the vine on the stone. I jumped up, heart pounding, and looked around. No one. Nothing. But when I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped my breath. The vine on the gravestone, it was moving. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd imagined it. After all, the mind can play tricks when you're alone in a place like that. I left the cemetery, but I couldn't stop thinking about that grave. I dreamed about it that night. Twisting, writhing vines and a face I couldn't see but felt deep in my bones. The next day, I went back. I don't know why I did it, but I had to know what was wrong with that grave. As I approached it, my stomach twisted. The vine on the stone was larger now, more pronounced, and this time I could see something else, faint, as if it had been carved into the stone. A name. Eliza Rhodes. I didn't recognize the name, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I should. The days that followed were a blur. I started visiting the cemetery more often, drawn back by some invisible force, and each time the vine on the gravestone seemed to grow. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my wife. I didn't want to seem crazy, but something deep inside me knew that something was wrong. I started to feel like I was being watched, even when I was alone in the cemetery. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was standing at the grave, staring at the vine as it seemed to grow more rapidly, when I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing near the tree line, just watching me. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, dark, flowing robes that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Her face was hidden under a veil, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and sharp. I didn't move, I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear. She started walking toward me. slow, deliberate steps that made the ground beneath me feel like it was trembling. And as she got closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "You shouldn't have touched it," she whispered, her voice hollow like it came from the grave itself. "You've woken it." I didn't remember running, but somehow I was out of the cemetery, back at my car, heart pounding in my chest. The grave, the woman, the vine, it all felt like it had been part of a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I knew something was wrong, something ancient and malevolent that had been lying dormant in that cemetery for generations. That night I went home and I locked the doors, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, soft, faint, like they were coming from just beyond the walls. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but then I saw it. The vine, it was in my house. It had started growing along the edges of the walls, creeping under the floorboards, wrapping itself around the furniture like it owned the place. It wasn't real, I told myself, but when I tried to tear it away, it bled. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back to the cemetery. I thought that if I confronted whatever it was, I could end it. Maybe I could find out who Eliza Rhodes was, why her grave was so wrong. So I went to the cemetery, that same evening, heart in my throat. When I got there, everything was different. The sky was thick with clouds and the wind howled through the trees. The air felt wrong too, heavy, thick, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The grave was still there, but now the vine had spread across the entire cemetery. Every grave, every stone, every path, twisted, suffocating in vines. And in the center of it all, I saw her. Eliza Rhodes, standing at the foot of her grave, the veil pulled back, revealing a face that wasn't human. Her eyes were hollow sockets, and her skin, pale and decayed, hung from her bones like wet paper. She smiled at me, a slow, cruel grin that made my insides churn. "You should have left me alone," she said, her voice now echoing, coming from everywhere at once. "Now, you'll join us." That's when I realized, too late, that I wasn't just dealing with a restless spirit. This wasn't about a ghost. It was something older, something worse. And it had been waiting for me. For someone foolish enough to disturb the dead. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs anymore, until I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own heart thundering in my chest. I didn't look back. But as I lay in my bed that night, I could still feel the vine crawling across the walls under my skin. And I knew, deep down, that the cemetery had claimed me. They say no one ever stays away from Black Hollow Cemetery for long. People come and go, but the dead don't forget. It was a typical autumn evening when I first noticed something was wrong at the old cemetery. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to wander through, especially at night. The place had been around for generations, but the old headstones were eroded, and there was a certain heaviness in the air that made most people avoid it altogether. My name's Jack, and up until then, I'd never thought much about the cemetery on the hill, even though it loomed over our small town like an ancient ghost. The cemetery was right next to St. James Church, which had been there since the late 1800s. The church was well kept, its white steeple rising high into the sky, but the cemetery behind it was different. Overgrown grass, crooked, weathered stones made it look forgotten, like it belonged to a time no one remembered or cared about anymore. I wasn't a religious man, but my curiosity always got the best of me. On a late evening in October, I decided to take a walk there, mostly out of boredom. The setting sun bathed the place in an orange glow, the shadows long and stretching, like the cemetery itself was trying to escape the earth. The path was narrow and uneven, winding through the graves in a way that felt almost unnatural. The more I walked, the more I felt something watching me. It was subtle at first, like a chill brushing the back of my neck, but the longer I stayed, the stronger it became. I noticed a particular grave tucked away in the far corner. Unlike the others, it wasn't old or weathered. The stone was relatively new, the name etched clearly into the surface, Elise Hawthorne. The dates of her birth and death were recent, only a few months earlier, but that wasn't what caught my attention. There was something strange about the grave. The ground around it had been disturbed, like someone had been digging there recently. The grass was flattened in a way that didn't seem natural, almost as if someone had been kneeling by it for hours. I took a step closer, unable to shake the feeling that I was being pulled toward it. And then, I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows just beyond the grave. It wasn't a man or a woman. Not exactly. They were tall, too tall, and their features were obscured by the darkness. Their outline flickered like an old film reel, the edges frayed and distorted. It was almost like a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes, if it had any, locked on me. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't angry, it was something worse. It was waiting. I couldn't explain it, but something in me told me to leave, to run, before whatever that thing was noticed me. I turned around quickly and started walking back, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving faster than they should have been. Path seemed longer now, the cemetery stretching out before me like a maze I couldn't escape. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first I thought it was my own, echoing off the cold stone, but they didn't match my pace. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was following me, step by step. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My breath caught in my throat, and I hurried my pace, but the footsteps kept time with me. Suddenly I tripped. I fell hard onto the ground, scraping my hands on the rough stones beneath me. I heard a whisper, faint at first, like a voice from far away, then louder, closer. "You shouldn't be here." It was a woman's voice, smooth and chilling, like it was coming from the earth itself. I didn't wait to hear more. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of there. I don't know how I made it back to my car without looking back, but somehow I did. The headlights of my car seemed like the only thing that could push back the dark, and I didn't stop driving until I was far, far away from that place. I didn't go back to that cemetery after that night. I couldn't. Every time I passed by St. James Church, I felt that same pull toward it, but I resisted. A few weeks later, I heard the news. Elise Hawthorne had disappeared. The police had searched everywhere, but there was no trace of her. Her family had moved out of town, and no one had seen her for days. The story hit the papers, and I couldn't help but feel a sick, twisted sense of connection. I went back to that cemetery the next day, my curiosity gnawing at me again. I tried to shake the feeling, the nagging thought that whatever had been watching me, whatever had whispered those words, might still be out there. When I arrived, the grave had been disturbed again. The earth around it was freshly dug, and the stone had been knocked over. I could barely make out the name on the grave, Elise Hawthorne, but what struck me was the fresh, deep scratches across the stone. It looked like something, or someone, had been clawing at it. I turned to leave, my heart racing when I heard something. A voice. "You shouldn't have come back." This time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. I spun around, but there was no one there. No figure standing by the grave. Just the wind. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was back, just beyond the trees, barely visible, but unmistakable, and it was moving closer. I don't know why, but I ran again. I ran as fast as I could, past the gravestones, past the shadows, past the place where the dead waited in silence. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my hands trembling on the wheel. That night I went home, but the terror didn't stop. I kept hearing the voice, soft and low like a distant echo. I could feel it in my dreams, in the dark corners of my mind. And when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the dirt under my nails. The next day, they found the body, Elise Hawthorne. But she wasn't in the cemetery anymore. She had been found in the woods, not far from the old church, her body twisted in unnatural ways. They said it was an animal attack, but I knew better. I had seen what was waiting for her, the Watcher. They never found the person, or the thing, that had been haunting that cemetery. But people say it's still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next person to come too close to disturb what's best left untouched. And if you listen closely in the wind, you can still hear it. You shouldn't have come back. I don't visit that cemetery anymore. I don't think I ever will. It was a typical autumn evening when I first noticed something was wrong at the old cemetery. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to wander through, especially at night. The place had been around for generations, but the old headstones were eroded, and there was a certain heaviness in the air that made most people avoid it altogether. My name's Jack, and up until then, I'd never thought much about the cemetery on the hill, even though it loomed over our small town like an ancient ghost. The cemetery was right next to St. James Church, which had been there since the late 1800s. The church was well kept, its white steeple rising high into the sky, but the cemetery behind it was different. Overgrown grass and crooked, weathered stones made it look forgotten, like it belonged to a time no one remembered or cared about anymore. I wasn't a religious man, but my curiosity always got the best of me. On a late evening in October, I decided to take a walk there, mostly out of boredom. The setting sun bathed the place in an orange glow, the shadows long and stretching, like the cemetery itself was trying to escape the earth. The path was narrow and uneven, winding through the graves in a way that felt almost unnatural. The more I walked, the more I felt something watching me. It was subtle at first, like a chill brushing the back of my neck, but the longer I stayed, the stronger it became. I noticed a particular grave tucked away in the far corner. Unlike the others, it wasn't old or weathered. The stone was relatively new, the name etched clearly into the surface, Elise Hawthorne. The dates of her birth and death were recent, only a few months earlier, but that wasn't what caught my attention. There was something strange about the grave. The ground around it had been disturbed, like someone had been digging there recently. The grass was flattened in a way that didn't seem natural, almost as if someone had been kneeling by it for hours. I took a step closer, unable to shake the feeling that I was being pulled toward it. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the grave. It wasn't a man or a woman. Not exactly. They were tall, too tall, and their features were obscured by the darkness. Their outline flickered like an old film reel, the edges frayed and distorted. It was almost like a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes, if it had any, locked on me. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't angry, it was something worse. It was waiting. I couldn't explain it, but something in me told me to leave, to run, before whatever that thing was noticed me. I turned around quickly and started walking back, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving faster than they should have been. The path seemed longer now, the cemetery stretching out before me like a maze I couldn't escape. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first I thought it was my own, echoing off the cold stone, but they didn't match my pace. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was following me, step by step. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My breath caught in my throat, and I hurried my pace, but the footsteps kept time with me. Suddenly I tripped. I fell hard onto the ground, scraping my hands on the rough stones beneath me. I heard a whisper, faint at first, like a voice from far away, then louder, closer. "You shouldn't be here." It was a woman's voice, smooth and chilling, like it was coming from the earth itself. I didn't wait to hear more. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of there. I don't know how I made it back to my car without looking back, but somehow I did. The headlights of my car seemed like the only thing that could push back the dark, and I didn't stop driving until I was far, far away from that place. I didn't go back to that cemetery after that night. I couldn't. Every time I passed by St. James Church, I felt that same pull toward it, but I resisted. A few weeks later, I heard the news. Elise Hawthorne had disappeared. The police had searched everywhere, but there was no trace of her. Her family had moved out of town, and no one had seen her for days. The story hit the papers, and I couldn't help but feel a sick, twisted sense of connection. I went back to that cemetery the next day, my curiosity gnawing at me again. I tried to shake the feeling, the nagging thought that whatever had been watching me, whatever had whispered those words, might still be out there. When I arrived, the grave had been disturbed again. The earth around it was freshly dug, and the stone had been knocked over. I could barely make out the name on the grave, Elise Hawthorne, but what struck me was the fresh, deep scratches across the stone. It looked like something, or someone, had been clawing at it. I turned to leave, my heart racing when I heard something. A voice. "You shouldn't have come back." This time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. I spun around, but there was no one there. No figure standing by the grave. Just the wind. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was back, just beyond the trees, barely visible, but unmistakable, and it was moving closer. I don't know why, but I ran again. I ran as fast as I could, past the gravestones, past the shadows, past the place where the dead waited in silence. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my hands trembling on the wheel. That night I went home, but the terror didn't stop. I kept hearing the voice, soft and low like a distant echo. I could feel it in my dreams, in the dark corners of my mind. And when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the dirt under my nails. The next day, they found the body, Elise Hawthorne. But she wasn't in the cemetery anymore. She had been found in the woods, not far from the old church, her body twisted in unnatural ways. They said it was an animal attack, but I knew better. I had seen what was waiting for her, the Watcher. They never found the person, or the thing, that had been haunting that cemetery. But people say it's still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next person to come too close to disturb what's best left untouched. And if you listen closely in the wind, you can still hear it. You shouldn't have come back. I don't visit that cemetery anymore. I don't think I ever will. It was just past midnight when I made my way to the old cemetery at the edge of town. The air was thick, like a blanket that pressed down on your chest. I wasn't used to walking through places like that, not at my age at least, but something was pulling me there, something I couldn't shake off. You know the feeling. You get it when you're standing in front of your house at night, and you look up and see the windows staring back at you like eyes. It's that same gut feeling, but worse. The cemetery wasn't even on the map anymore. At least, not officially. It was overgrown, neglected, forgotten by the people who once lived here, left behind as the world moved on. I'd heard about it from an old woman in town who used to be a friend of my grandmother's. She told me it was a place where the dead never rest. I didn't believe her. I thought she was just crazy, a little off her rocker with old age, but that was before I found the letter. The letter had been slipped under my door one evening. The handwriting was old, smudged, but I could make out the words, "You don't remember me, but I remember you. Come to the cemetery at midnight, and there's something you need to see." It was signed with a name I didn't recognize, Elizabeth Rayner. I didn't know anyone by that name. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I'd moved back to this town after 20 years, trying to put my past behind me. My father died last year, and my mother had passed before him. The house they left me was old, just like the town, just like the cemetery. But as soon as I opened that letter, I felt like I was being pulled back into something I wasn't ready to face. I grabbed my jacket, headed out the door, and walked to the cemetery. The path leading to it was narrow, overgrown with brambles and thorns. The kind of path no one bothered to walk on anymore. The kind of path that didn't look like it led anywhere good. The full moon hung overhead, casting long shadows that danced between the crooked tombstones. I stepped carefully, my boots crunching softly against the damp earth. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and decay. I could feel the weight of the place pressing in on me, the earth heavy under my feet like it wanted to swallow me whole. But I kept walking, even as every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. I made it to the heart of the cemetery, the place where the oldest graves were. The stone markers were cracked, faded, the names barely legible, eroded by time. And in the middle of it all, I saw her, Elizabeth Rayner. She was standing by a gravestone, her back to me, her long gray hair cascading down her shoulders. She was wearing an old, tattered black dress, the kind you see in pictures from 100 years ago. "Elizabeth," I called out, though the name felt strange on my lips. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine. They were hollow, sunken deep into her skull, and yet they glowed with a kind of unnatural light. "You came," she said, her voice soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. I nodded, too nervous to speak. "I told you, didn't I?" she continued. "The dead are never really gone. They just wait." I looked around, uneasy. Something didn't feel right. The cemetery felt alive, as if the stones were watching and the shadows shifting and moving. "What do you mean?" I asked. She stepped closer, and for the first time I noticed how cold she was. The air around her seemed to chill, like standing in front of an open freezer. "There's something here," she said, her voice trembling now. "Something that's been waiting for a long time, something buried. A curse. A promise." My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to escape whatever had drawn me here. "Look," she said, pointing to the grave in front of us. The stone was broken, cracked down the middle. The name was barely readable, but I could make out the first few letters, M-A-R. I leaned closer, trying to see more, but the letters shifted, the name blurring as if the stone was alive, changing before my eyes. "That's not possible," I whispered. Elizabeth nodded. "It's not, but it's happening. They're waking up." I didn't understand. I wanted to ask more, but the ground beneath us seemed to shift. There was a low, grating sound like stone scraping against stone. The earth trembled, a deep vibration that sent a chill through my spine, and then I saw it. A hand. Slowly, a skeletal hand emerged from the earth, fingers clawing at the ground. It was followed by another, and another, until the body was pulling itself from the soil, its blackened skin stretched tight over the bones, its eyes wide and unblinking. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "It's happening," Elizabeth said, her voice distant, like she was already fading. "You shouldn't have come." Before I could say anything, the ground shifted again, and the figure lunged toward me. A cold, clammy hand grabbed my wrist, pulling me down, and the earth opened up beneath me like a mouth hungry for more. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my body shaking. The sunlight was just beginning to creep through the curtains. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. But there was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "You're not alone." I glanced out the window, my heart still racing. The cemetery was still there, just beyond the trees, waiting. I hadn't dreamt it. I didn't know if it was too late, but I had to find out. It had rained all day, not the pleasant kind of rain, drizzling, soft, and comforting, but the kind that makes the earth smell rotten, the sky as gray as an old newspaper. The kind of rain that keeps the world locked away in a kind of heavy, oppressive stillness. I was walking home, the streets empty except for the occasional car speeding by. The town was quiet, too quiet, and the thought of getting home to my warm bed was about the only thing that kept me moving. But there was one thing that kept pulling at me, a thing I couldn't quite shake off, even though I tried my damnedest. The cemetery. It sat at the edge of town, right by the old woods, hidden away behind a line of rusted iron gates that no one seemed to bother with anymore. I'd heard stories about the place, of course. Every small town has its share of ghost stories, its share of places you're told to avoid, but this one had a reputation. The locals said that at night you could hear voices, whispers in the dark coming from the graves. They said if you went past the gates, you'd hear something following you, not footsteps, not the kind of sound a living person makes. No, this was something else. A dragging, a scraping, like something was just out of sight, waiting. I'd never been there myself. I mean, who would? But as I walked past it, with the rain still pouring down, something made me stop. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the sheer quiet of the world around me, but I felt my feet move before I even realized it. I was crossing the street, walking down the narrow path that led to the cemetery gates. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't make myself turn back. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gates. There was no sound, nothing. The rain had softened, but the silence felt too thick, too dense. And for the first time, I could feel the weight of it, the weight of something watching me. Then I saw it. A figure standing just inside the gates, just far enough that it could be mistaken for a shadow. It wasn't moving, just standing there staring out at me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew without a doubt that something was wrong. My skin crawled. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. But then the figure moved. Slowly enough that I knew it wasn't a person. It was something else, something that had been waiting. I should have turned and run. I should have screamed. But instead, I did the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I stepped forward. The gates creaked as I pushed them open, sound sharp and unsettling in the thick air. My shoes splashed in the mud as I stepped into the cemetery. The rain had started to pick up again, but it didn't matter. It felt like the air was thicker in here, like the sky had come closer. The stones towered over me, old and worn, some half sunken into the earth. The names on the gravestones were barely readable, as if time had already started erasing them. I walked deeper into the cemetery, unable to stop myself. It was like something was pulling me in, something that had been buried a long time ago, and now it wanted me. And then I heard it, a sound from behind me. It wasn't a whisper, but it was too close, a low, dragging noise. I turned, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the fog and the rain. I kept walking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel something moving just beyond my sight, something following me. It wasn't a person, I knew that. The air was too still for it to be anything alive. I passed more graves, old ones with names I couldn't make out, and then I saw it. A small, worn tombstone, the name barely visible. Hannah Rain. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew that name. I'd heard it growing up, had heard the whispers from the older folks in town. They said Hannah Rain had died young, under strange circumstances. They said she was buried here, and that every year, on the night of the full moon, she came back. But she wasn't the one I was looking for. I felt something cold on the back of my neck. It wasn't the rain, it wasn't the wind. It was a presence that was too close. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw her. A woman standing just a few feet away. She was wearing an old, torn dress like something out of the past. Her hair hung in wet, stringy clumps around her face. She was looking down at the ground, her eyes hidden in the shadow of her hair. I froze. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, still and silent. I took a slow step back, but before I could turn, she spoke. "Help me?" Her voice was barely more than a breath, a rasping sound that made my skin crawl. "Please," she said, her head jerking up, her eyes wide and empty. "Help me, before it's too late." I didn't know what she meant. I didn't want to know. I turned and ran, my legs moving before my brain could even process it. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of something dragging along the ground was right behind me, growing louder with every step I took. I didn't stop until I reached the gates again. But when I looked back, there was no one there. No woman, no dragging sound, just the rain and the fog. But I knew she was still there. The cemetery had a way of keeping things, of holding on to them long after they were gone. And when I got home, when I locked my door and sat down to try and make sense of what happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something faint. A voice, so soft I could barely hear it. "Help me." And I knew, deep down, that I hadn't left the cemetery alone. It was a cold, biting autumn evening when I made the mistake. The wind howled through the trees like a beast caught in a trap, shaking the branches and making the leaves dance in the air. It was the kind of night that made you want to stay inside, curl up with a blanket and forget the world outside. But not me. I was always drawn to the darker side of things, the parts of life people don't talk about, and that's what led me to the cemetery. I had been living in the small town of Ashford for just over a year. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone's business, and the local cemetery was as much a part of the town's history as the town itself. Ashford was built around the cemetery. It was old, older than the town, older than most of the people who lived there. Some said the cemetery had been established back in the 1800s, before the first houses were even built. And over the years, rumors had started to swirl. The graves, some of them cracked and crumbling, had a way of whispering, people said. At night, when the wind was just right, you could hear soft murmurs coming from beneath the ground. People claimed they heard voices, the kind of voices that didn't belong to anyone they knew, voices from the past. Most shrugged it off as old superstition, but I wasn't so sure. And that's how I found myself standing in front of the iron gates one fateful evening, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. I had heard the stories, of course. My curiosity got the better of me, and that was my first mistake. I had just left my car at the edge of the cemetery, the only one parked near the gates, the others long gone. The rain had been heavy earlier, but it had stopped for now, leaving the ground muddy and slick. I was alone, my breath visible in the chilly air, and I felt a nervous excitement tingling in my veins. I had come to find the truth. But the truth, as I was about to learn, is a dangerous thing. I walked through the rusted gates, the metal creaking as I passed. The cemetery was vast, stretching out before me in the dim light of the fading day. There were hundreds of headstones, old, weathered stones with inscriptions that had long since faded into obscurity. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was something else, something different in the air, something heavy. The further I walked into the cemetery, the more I could feel it, the sensation that I wasn't alone. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the eerie feeling that comes with being in a place like this. But then I heard it, a whisper, soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, but it was a voice. The voice seemed to call my name. I stopped, frozen in place. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer, just the wind. I continued walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was colder now, the temperature dropping by the minute, but I wasn't about to turn back. I had come for answers, and answers I was going to get. The whispers grew louder. At first they were distant, coming from the far end of the cemetery, but then they seemed to move, coming closer. I started to walk faster, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that was crawling up my spine. I glanced to my left, and that's when I saw her. She was standing near a crumbling gravestone, her figure cloaked in shadow. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a figure formed by the darkening sky, but then she moved, slowly. Her hair was dark and disheveled, hanging in wet strands around her pale face, her eyes wide and hollow, locked onto mine. I froze again. My breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying me, before slowly lifting her hand. Her finger pointed at something behind me. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the graves, the headstones, the same endless rows of stone. When I turned back to ask her what she meant, she was gone. Panic surged through me. I turned in every direction, searching, but there was no sign of her. My mind was racing, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined it. But then I heard it again. A voice. Clearer this time, though still faint. It came from the ground beneath my feet. "Help! Me!" I looked down at the grave I was standing over, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. The dirt around the tombstone was disturbed, freshly dug, as if someone had been there recently. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I touched the cool earth. The voice came again, softer now, desperate. "Help me, before it's too late." A chill shot through my spine. I stood up quickly, almost knocking into the gravestone. The name on the stone, worn and difficult to read, was Eleanor Hawks. I didn't know the name, but something about it made my stomach churn. Something about this grave felt wrong. Suddenly, I wasn't alone again. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers returned, louder now, coming from all around me. I could hear them, voices murmuring, begging, pleading. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was moving. I could feel something pulling at me, pulling me deeper into the cemetery. The woman's voice came once more. "It's too late. You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, panic surging through me. My legs were shaky, and I was about to turn and run when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, dragging. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the shadows, deepening as the night took hold. The whispers grew louder still, their urgency rising. I turned and ran, my feet slipping in the mud, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel something behind me, something close, almost touching me. I reached the gates, barely able to catch my breath. I pushed them open, stumbling into the street. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I looked back at the cemetery, and for a moment I thought I saw her again, standing by the gate, watching me. But the moment was gone, and the cemetery was empty once more. I drove home in a daze, the voices still echoing in my head. The feeling of being followed lingered long after I had parked my car and locked the doors. And that night, when I lay in bed, the whispers didn't stop. They kept coming soft at first, then louder, clearer, and always the same words. "Help me?" Oh, I never went back to that cemetery. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the whispers, and I know deep down that I never left that night. Not really. The cemetery isn't done with me yet. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the first thing you need to know. I didn't plan on ending up at Granger Cemetery that night. It wasn't in the cards, and I don't believe in fate. But something inside me pushed me toward that gate, and I've been trying to understand it ever since. Granger Cemetery was old, probably older than the town itself, tucked away just off the main road. It had been the subject of rumors for as long as I'd lived in Hawthorne. You know the type. Whispers in the diner, half-drunken tales told around campfires. Some said the dead in that cemetery never truly rested. Some said they could still hear the wind howling through the graves at night, carrying the voices of the long gone. I thought it was all bullshit, of course. I was just a kid at the time, barely out of high school. You think you know everything at that age. But there's something about a place that feels wrong, even when you can't put your finger on it. And Granger Cemetery had that vibe. It all started one rainy evening in October. I had been working at a gas station near the outskirts of town, just filling in for a buddy. It wasn't a big deal. You've probably worked a shift like that before. Slow, uneventful, the kind where you kill time by zoning out and staring at the clock. But that night, something was different. I should have gone home. It was nearly midnight, and the rain had picked up to the point where it felt like it might drown the whole town. But instead of going home, I took the long way through the back roads. You know how it is. There's something hypnotic about driving in the rain, the steady thump of tires on wet pavement, the blur of headlights reflecting off the wet road. That's when I saw it. The cemetery. The iron gate, barely visible through the rain, creaking open as if it was calling to me. I hadn't planned on stopping. But I did. I parked just outside the gate and sat there for a few minutes. The place looked as eerie as I'd always imagined, its headstones jutting out at odd angles like crooked teeth in a decaying mouth. Some of the graves had been there so long the names were completely illegible, while others were still pristine, fresh, as though someone was taking care of them. I hadn't seen anyone in town go near the cemetery for years, not since I was a kid, and even then, it was just the occasional old man or widow paying respects to relatives long dead. I got out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through my jacket. The cemetery felt different that night. Not just the chill in the air, but something deeper, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I walked through the gate, my boots squelching on the wet ground. I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't even sure why I was there, other than the nagging feeling in my chest telling me I had to be. But then something strange happened. I started walking down the path. The thing is, I had been to the cemetery before. It was small, only a few acres at most, and there were only two real paths, one along the edge and the main path that went straight down the middle. I had walked that path 100 times, even in my youth, when I dared my friends to come with me to the cemetery at night. But this night, I wasn't on either of those paths. I was on a path I didn't recognize. The trees overhead grew thicker, blocking out most of the moonlight. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and wet leaves. I was still walking. I couldn't explain why. It was like something was pulling me forward. I glanced down at my feet. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and there were no footprints behind me. Nothing to mark where I'd been. The path, or whatever it was, seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint at first that I thought it might have been the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice. It came from behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. I was alone, but I could still hear it. Soft. A name. Emily? I froze. Emily? That name, it felt familiar somehow, but I couldn't place it. I stood there for what felt like forever, just listening to the rain and the whispers. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. Emily, come back. Something shifted in me, a jolt of recognition. I knew that voice, or I thought I did, but it was impossible. The voice sounded like my mother, but she'd been dead for almost 5 years. I stumbled back, nearly tripping on a loose stone. My breath was ragged as panic surged through me. I turned around trying to find the exit, but the path behind me had disappeared. In its place was a thick fog, swirling in a way that felt alive. Help me! I couldn't breathe, and I could feel the air around me growing heavy, dense. My legs felt weak, my vision swimming. I tried to take a step, but my foot caught on something. When I looked down, I saw the thing that froze my blood. It was a grave marker, but not just any grave marker. It was fresh, newly placed, and the name on the stone was the one I had seen earlier, the one that had started this whole nightmare. Emily Hawthorne. I fell to my knees, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, closing in on me until I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. It was as if the very earth itself was calling my name, begging me to stay. And that's when I saw her, a figure draped in tattered clothes, standing at the edge of the grave. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque, silent scream. The same scream I had heard over and over, the one that had followed me through the fog. The voice. It wasn't my mother's voice. It was hers. Emily Hawthorne, the girl who had disappeared all those years ago, the one whose grave I'd stumbled upon. But Emily wasn't dead. She was here, with me, and she wanted something. The last thing I remember is hearing her voice, a whisper in my ear, soft and insistent. "Don't leave me here alone." And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was back by the cemetery gates, the rain still coming down. But it was all wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The cemetery was empty, but the grave, Emily Hawthorne's grave, was gone. And then I realized I was never supposed to leave. Not then, not ever.